There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that don't announce themselves with thunder, but with the quiet click of a closing door or the subtle shift of weight on a tired couch. They are the fault lines, the almost imperceptible cracks in the foundation of your daily existence that, in hindsight, you realize were the beginning of everything changing. You don't see the earthquake coming. You only feel the tremor long after it has passed, and you look back at the quiet, unassuming instant and understand it was the epicenter of your new world. For me, that moment wasn't a single instant, but a slow, creeping dawn that stretched over weeks, a gradual illumination of a truth that had been living in the shadows of my apartment all along. It began, as so many things did, with Leo asleep on my couch. It had become a familiar tableau, a piece of living art I had grown dangerously accustomed to studying. From my worn armchair in the corner of the living room, the city lights of the world outside filtered through the thin curtains, casting a bruised, purple glow across the room. The only other light was the pale, silver screen of my laptop, where a series of photographs I'd taken earlier that day lay waiting for edits I couldn't bring myself to make. My focus was not on the digital images, but on the analog reality breathing softly just a few feet away. Leo was sprawled on his back, one arm flung over his eyes to block out the ambient light, the other hanging limply over the edge of the cushion, his fingers nearly brushing the worn wooden floor. His chest rose and fell in the slow, even rhythm of deep sleep, a cadence that had become the unofficial metronome of my evenings. The old, gray wool blanket I kept draped over the back of the couch was pulled up to his waist, a flimsy fortress against the night's chill that I had put there an hour ago, my movements as silent and practiced as a prayer. This was the ritual, the unspoken agreement that had settled between us in the months since his world had fractured. He would show up in the late afternoon, a ghost at my door with his laptop bag slung over one shoulder and the weight of a long day etched into the lines around his eyes. He'd shed his consultant's armor, the crisp shirt, the polished shoes, and fold himself into the soft geography of my living room, becoming less of the man the world saw and more of the boy I remembered. We would talk, or not talk. Sometimes he would vent about impossible clients and recursive code that refused to yield, his voice a low, frustrated hum. Other times, we would exist in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clatter of my keyboard and the gentle hiss of the radiator. Then, inevitably, as the evening bled into night, his energy would wane, his words would slur with fatigue, and his eyes would glaze over while staring at some meaningless late-night show. I'd watch the tension drain from his shoulders as sleep claimed him, a slow, gentle surrender. And I would stay up, a silent sentinel, watching over him until my own eyelids grew heavy, caught in the gravitational pull of his stillness. Tonight, however, felt different. A current of something new and unsettling was moving through the quiet air of the room. It was in the way he had arrived, not with the usual tired resignation, but with a kind of frantic, hunted energy, as if he were outrunning something he couldn't name. He had barely spoken, just dropped his bag by the door, grabbed a bottle of water from my fridge, and collapsed onto the couch as if his strings had been cut. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was taut, vibrating with unspoken anxieties. I watched him now, really watched him, and saw things the darkness usually hid. I saw the faint tremor in his hand before it had stilled in sleep. I saw the way his brow was still subtly furrowed, a crease of worry that sleep hadn't managed to smooth away. He was here, in my space, seeking a sanctuary I was terrified I couldn't truly provide, because the peace he found here was built on a foundation of my own carefully concealed secrets. Every night he spent on that couch was another stone laid on the fragile wall I had built around my heart, a wall I feared was beginning to crumble under the gentle, persistent pressure of his presence. And as I sat there, listening to the sound of his breathing, a single, terrifying thought bloomed in the quiet of my mind. This couldn't last. Something had to break. To understand the weight of that blanket, the significance of that unlocked door, you would have to understand the architecture of our friendship, a structure we had been building for almost a decade. We met in college, two celestial bodies on wildly different orbits that somehow found themselves tethered by an inexplicable gravity. I was on the swim team, a creature of solitude and repetition, finding my peace in the lonely, chlorinated silence of the early morning pool. My world was measured in lengths and split times, a discipline of pushing my own body to its limits in quiet anonymity. I was a distance swimmer, all about endurance and rhythm, finding a meditative state in the endless black line at the bottom of the pool. Leo was a swimmer too, but he was the opposite kind of energy. He was a sprinter, a supernova of muscle and explosive power, his presence on the pool deck a riot of loud laughter and easy confidence. He moved through the world as if it were his to conquer, collecting friends and accolades with a seemingly effortless charm. I watched him from a distance for the first year, an observer cataloging a foreign species. He was all bright surfaces and kinetic energy, while I felt like a developing photograph, my true self only visible in the quiet dark. I never imagined our paths would properly cross beyond the occasional shared lane or team meeting. But one brutal winter afternoon, after a particularly grueling practice, I found him sitting alone on the bleachers, his usual vibrant aura dimmed to a low flicker. He was staring at his phone, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. His then-girlfriend, a girl from the track team whose name I can't even remember now, had just broken up with him via text message. It was a common, callous act of collegiate romance, but it had leveled him. I almost kept walking. It was my nature to avoid such overt displays of emotion, to grant people the privacy of their pain. But something in his posture, a profound and uncharacteristic vulnerability, stopped me. I sat down a few feet away, not saying a word, just taking off my own swim cap and running a hand through my damp hair. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the distant echo of the diving team practicing in the well. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. She said I'm too much. It wasn't a question or a complaint, just a statement of fact dropped into the empty space between us. I didn't know what to say. I had always thought of him as perfectly calibrated for the world, the ideal amount of everything. So I just said the first honest thing that came to mind. No, you're not. He finally looked at me then, his eyes red-rimmed and confused, as if seeing me for the first time. A flicker of a smile, weak but genuine, touched his lips. Thanks, Julian, that was it. That was the beginning. From that small, shared moment of quiet support, a friendship bloomed, improbable and deep. We became roommates the following year, our dynamic falling into a natural rhythm. He was the tide that pulled the social world into our small apartment, and I was the quiet harbor where he could anchor when the storms rolled in. He drew me out of my shell, coaxing me into a world of people and noise I would have otherwise avoided, while I provided a space of calm that seemed to soothe the restless engine inside him. It was during those years, living in the close quarters of that drafty off-campus apartment, that my feelings for him began to change, to deepen into something more complex and treacherous. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping realization, like watching a photograph develop in a tray of chemicals. The image had always been there, latent and invisible, but gradually, the details began to emerge with painful clarity. It was in the small, unguarded moments. The way he'd hum off-key while making coffee in the morning, the concentrated frown on his face when he was trying to fix something broken, the way his laughter would fill the entire space, chasing out the shadows. I started to see him not as the confident sprinter the world saw, but as the man who was terrified of thunderstorms, who could spend hours meticulously building elaborate Lego sets, who felt things so deeply that he sometimes had to mask it with a joke. I fell in love with the quiet Leo, the one who only ever seemed to emerge when it was just the two of us. I buried this love deep, building a fortress around it. He was my best friend, and he was, by all accounts, completely and unshakably straight. His life was a revolving door of bright, smiling women who seemed to adore his energy. I learned to be the supportive friend, the good listener, the one who offered advice on relationships I secretly wished he was having with me. Each new girlfriend was a fresh layer of brick on the wall I was building inside myself. It was an act of self-preservation. To tell him the truth would be to risk the very foundation of my world. The potential loss of his friendship was a cataclysm I couldn't bear to contemplate, so I became an expert in the art of repression, a curator of a secret museum of feelings that no one else would ever see. My photography became my only outlet, a place where I could channel all that unspoken yearning. I learned to capture the beauty in fleeting moments, in the way light fell on a lonely street or the hidden emotion in a stranger's face. My art was filled with a quiet melancholy, a longing for connection that I couldn't express in any other way. After college, we got separate apartments in the same city. It felt like a natural progression, a step towards proper adulthood. But the tether between us remained. We still saw each other multiple times a week, our friendship a constant, stable landmass in the shifting seas of our 20s. He was climbing the corporate ladder as a software consultant, his days filled with meetings and deadlines, while I was trying to make a life as a freelance photographer, my days a patchwork of odd jobs and personal projects. And then came Chloe. She was different from the others, more serious, more integrated into his life. They dated for 2 years, and for a while, I thought he had finally found his person. I did my best to be happy for him, to be a good friend to her, even as every shared laugh and casual touch between them felt like a small, sharp paper cut on my soul. I perfected my mask of cheerful platonic affection, becoming a master of redirection and emotional subterfuge. I thought I had settled into this role, that I had made my peace with being the permanent fixture in the background of his life. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure that only I seemed to notice. It started about 6 months before their eventual breakup. Leo began to seem distant, not from me, but from his own life. The light in his eyes, that vibrant, confident spark, was dimming. He talked less about work, less about Chloe, less about the future. When he was at my apartment, he was quieter, more withdrawn. He would sit on my couch and stare into space, his mind a million miles away. I recognized the look. It was the same haunted expression he'd worn on the bleachers all those years ago. But this time, the cause was not a simple, clean break, but a slow, internal erosion. He was unhappy, but it was a deep, foundational unhappiness that he couldn't articulate. He was a man living in a house he had meticulously built, only to realize he felt like a stranger in every room. When he and Chloe finally broke up, it wasn't the explosive, dramatic event I might have expected. It was a quiet, mutual dissolution, a recognition that they were two people walking on parallel paths that would never converge. He told me about it one evening, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He didn't seem heartbroken, just empty, hollowed out. He spoke of the breakup as if it were a symptom, not the disease itself. The disease was a profound sense of dislocation, a feeling that the life he was leading wasn't his own. He had followed the blueprint for success, good job, serious relationship, stable future, but it had brought him no joy, only a quiet, persistent ache of loneliness. He felt like an actor playing a role he had never auditioned for. And that's when he started showing up at my apartment. At first, it was just for dinner once or twice a week. He said he hated cooking for one in his sterile, empty apartment, a place that was now haunted by the ghost of his failed relationship. My place was smaller, messier, but it was lived in. It had history. It had me. Soon, dinner became watching a movie. Watching a movie became him dozing off on the couch. His arrivals grew earlier, his departures later, until they ceased altogether on some nights. He never asked. He never explained. He would just appear at my door, a silent refugee seeking asylum, and I would always let him in. I never questioned it. A part of me, the selfish, hopeful part one tried to keep locked away, was thrilled. Having him here, in my space, felt like a quiet correction of the universe. But the other part of me, the rational, self-protective part, was screaming a warning. I was letting him blur the lines, letting him use my home and my presence as a temporary balm for a wound I couldn't see, a wound that had nothing to do with me. I was becoming a convenience, a safe harbor he would inevitably sail away from once he was repaired. The ritual solidified over the course of a long autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and Leo's presence in my apartment became as regular as the setting sun. It was a slow, creeping invasion of my space and my solitude, an occupation I had tacitly approved. He started leaving things behind, small markers of his territory. A toothbrush in a mug by my sink. A worn-out sweatshirt he favored, draped over the back of my armchair. A spare phone charger plugged permanently into the wall by the couch. Each item was a small anchor, tethering him more securely to my life. His own apartment, a sleek, modern space in a newer building across town, became little more than a place to store his clothes and receive his mail. He spoke of it as a cold, impersonal box, while my home, with its mismatched furniture and stacks of photography books, was a place he could breathe. I became a student of his sleeping habits, an unwilling expert on the topography of his unconsciousness. I learned that he kicked his legs when he was dreaming of running, that he sometimes mumbled snippets of code in his sleep, and that on nights when his anxiety was particularly high, he would curl into a tight ball, his hands clenched into fists. On those nights, I would drape the wool blanket over him with extra care, tucking it around his shoulders as if the simple weight of it could hold his demons at bay. I would linger for a moment, my hand hovering just above his hair, the urge to reach out and smooth it back so powerful it made my fingers ache. But I never did. The boundary between us was invisible but palpable, a pane of glass I could see through but dared not touch for fear of shattering everything. My life began to revolve around this strange, new domesticity. I found myself buying his favorite brand of coffee, stocking the fridge with the craft beer he liked, making sure the gray blanket was always clean and folded, ready for him. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, was recalibrating itself around him, molding itself to accommodate his presence. The most significant part of the ritual was the door. My bedroom was just off the small hallway from the living room. Every night, before I retreated to my own bed, I would pause at the threshold. I would look back at his sleeping form on the couch, a dark shape in the moonlit room, and I would leave my bedroom door slightly ajar. It was a silent invitation, a signal. It meant, you are not alone here. If you wake up, if you need something, this space is not closed to you. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability on my part, an opening of my most private space. I didn't know if he ever noticed. In the morning, the door would always be in the same position I had left it, and he would be either still asleep on the couch or already gone, a hastily scribbled thank you note left on the kitchen counter. I clung to this ambiguity. It allowed me to believe that my actions were purely platonic, an act of a concerned friend. But I knew, in the honest, silent chambers of my own heart, that leaving the door open was a coded message, a hope I was sending out into the darkness, a hope that one night, he might actually walk through it. One Tuesday night in late November, the first real cold snap of the season hit the city. A bitter wind rattled the old windows of my apartment building, and a thin, icy rain slicked the streets outside. Leo arrived looking more battered than usual, his face pale and drawn. A massive project at work had gone sideways, and he had spent the last 48 hours in a frantic state of damage control. He didn't even have his bag with him. He'd come straight from the office, looking like a soldier staggering away from a lost battle. He collapsed onto the couch without a word, and I made him a cup of tea, wrapping his cold hands around the warm mug. He drank it in silence, his eyes fixed on the frantic dance of the rain against the window pane. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual confidence stripped away, leaving behind something raw and fragile. He fell asleep within the hour, succumbing to a bone-deep exhaustion. I watched him for a long time, the sound of the wind and rain a mournful soundtrack to the quiet scene. He shivered in his sleep, his thin work shirt offering little protection against the chill that seemed to seep in through the very walls. The gray wool blanket didn't feel like enough tonight. A wave of protectiveness, fierce and overwhelming, washed over me. It was an impulse that bypassed all my carefully constructed defenses. On quiet feet, I went to my bedroom and pulled the heavy down comforter from my own bed. It was old and heavy, a comforting weight. I carried it out to the living room and gently, carefully, spread it over him, tucking it in around his body until he was cocooned in its warmth. He stirred, a soft noise of protest in his throat, and his eyes fluttered open for a brief second. They were unfocused, clouded with sleep, but they found mine in the dim light. "Julian," he murmured, his voice thick and slurred. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the storm. "Go back to sleep," he did. His body relaxed under the weight of the comforter, and his breathing deepened once more. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. In that moment, he hadn't been my friend sleeping on the couch. He had been something else, something more. And I had crossed a line, moving from passive caregiver to active comforter. The glass pane between us suddenly felt thinner, more fragile than ever. The days that followed were charged with a new kind of tension. The incident with the comforter, as small as it was, had altered the emotional landscape between us. It was a secret we now shared, even if he didn't consciously remember it. I felt it in the way he looked at me, a new flicker of something in his eyes, gratitude, maybe, or confusion. He started seeking out more physical proximity when he was awake. He would sit closer to me on the couch, our shoulders occasionally brushing. He would stand next to me in the kitchen while I cooked, leaning against the counter, creating a shared space that felt both comfortable and intensely intimate. I was hyper-aware of every single point of contact, every accidental brush of our hands, every moment the space between us shrank. My entire nervous system felt like it had been rewired, every nerve ending humming with a heightened sensitivity to his presence. It was both intoxicating and terrifying. I was living in a state of sustained, low-grade anxiety, constantly analyzing, interpreting, and second-guessing every gesture, every word, every look. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for a verdict I didn't know how to ask for. The breaking point, the moment the world finally tilted on its axis, came on a Thursday night. It was just a few weeks before Christmas, and the city was dressed in its holiday finery, a spectacle of cheerful lights and manufactured joy that felt jarringly at odds with the quiet tension in my apartment. Leo had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful, introspective mood having settled over him. We had eaten dinner in near silence, and now we were sitting on the couch, a documentary about deep-sea exploration playing on the television, its narrator's soothing voice filling the room. He hadn't yet succumbed to his usual fatigue-induced sleep. He was awake, alert, and unnervingly still beside me. The space between our bodies on the couch cushions was a charged territory, a no-man's land pulsing with unspoken things. I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, inches from my own. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My senses were so overwhelmed by my proximity to him that I could barely follow the film. I felt his eyes on me. I turned my head slowly to meet his gaze. The blue light from the television flickered across his face, casting strange shadows and highlights. His expression was one I had never seen before. It was open, vulnerable, and filled with a kind of searching intensity that made the air feel thin in my lungs. The narrator was talking about the immense pressure in the deep ocean, how it could crush a submarine as if it were a tin can. I felt that pressure in my own chest, a crushing weight of years of unspoken feelings, of carefully guarded hopes. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and in that look, I saw a question. It was a question he didn't seem to know how to form into words. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of us, on this couch, in this dimly lit room, suspended in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. "Can I ask you something stupid?" His voice was a whisper, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. It was rough, laced with an uncertainty that was so unlike him. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. I could only manage a nod, my throat suddenly too tight for words. He took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't want to sleep on the couch tonight," he said, the words hanging in the air between us, fragile and heavy. Can I stay here? With you? In your bed," he rushed the last part out, as if afraid the words themselves would burn him. He wasn't propositioning me. It wasn't about sex. The request was something purer, more elemental than that. It was a plea for closeness, for a different kind of sanctuary, a deeper level of comfort than the couch could offer. It was the question I had been both dreading and longing for him to ask for years. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart didn't just crumble, they evaporated. All the reasons I should say no, all the logic about self-preservation and protecting our friendship, it all dissolved in the face of the raw vulnerability in his eyes. This was Leo, my Leo, looking lost and asking me for a safe harbor. And I would never, could never, turn him away. "Yes," I said, my own voice a stranger to my ears. "Okay." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. It was as if he had been holding up a tremendous weight and had just been given permission to finally set it down. We moved without speaking, as if in a dream. I turned off the television, plunging the room into near darkness. I led the way down the short hall to my bedroom, my body moving on autopilot, my mind a maelstrom of shock and hope and terror. I left the door wide open behind us. My bedroom was small, dominated by my queen-sized bed. The only light came from the streetlights outside, filtering through the blinds and striping the room in silver and gray. We undressed in the shadows, a quiet, almost formal shedding of our daily armor. I slipped into my side of the bed, my back to him, my body rigid with tension. I heard him slide in behind me, the mattress dipping with his weight. The space between us felt like a chasm, miles wide. We lay there in the silence, two separate islands in the same sea, neither of us moving, barely breathing. The silence was different from all our other silences. It was not comfortable. It was electric, filled with the thunder of our own heartbeats. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I was acutely aware of his warmth behind me, a sun I was afraid to turn towards. I thought, this is it. This is the moment I will replay in my mind forever. The moment when everything could have changed, but didn't. Julian. His whisper sliced through the dark, right next to my ear. I felt the warmth of his breath on my neck, and a shiver traced its way down my spine. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Yeah. I breathed out. There was another long pause, a hesitation so profound I could feel it as a physical force in the room. He was wrestling with something, fighting a battle I could only guess at. Then he moved. He shifted closer, until his chest was pressed lightly against my back. He draped an arm over my waist, his hand coming to rest on my hip. The touch was tentative, a question in itself. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to flinch, to pull away, to protect myself. But I didn't. I forced myself to remain still, to accept the contact, to let him anchor himself to me. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was seeking, a person lost in the dark reaching for something solid. He rested his forehead between my shoulder blades, and I could feel the soft puff of his breath against my shirt. He was so close now, I could feel the frantic, unsteady rhythm of his heart against my back. It was beating as wildly as my own. Would it be okay, he began, his voice thick with a terrifying fragility, if I... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what he was asking. It was the final, irreversible question. The one that would change the landscape forever. The one that would either build a bridge across the chasm between us, or send us both plunging into it. I gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the answer he needed. He gently used the hand on my hip to turn me onto my back, and then onto my side, until we were facing each other in the striped darkness. His face was inches from mine, his features obscured by shadows, but I could feel the heat of his gaze. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. The touch was feather-light, impossibly tender. And then, he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was not what I had imagined in 1,000 secret daydreams. It was not passionate or hungry or confident. It was hesitant, soft, and deeply uncertain. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt and confusion. It was the gentlest of collisions, a tentative exploration in the dark. I responded with equal hesitation, meeting his uncertainty with my own. My hand came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart, feeling its frantic, bird-like flutter against my palm. The kiss lasted for only a few seconds, but it contained the weight of a decade of unspoken history. When he pulled back, he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed, sharing the same small pocket of air. In the profound silence that followed, I heard a sound. It was a single, choked sob that escaped from his chest. And then another. He was crying, silent, shuddering tears in the darkness. I didn't ask why. I just wrapped my arms around him and held him, pulling him close as his quiet grief finally broke free. And I held him until the shaking subsided, and his breathing evened out into the familiar rhythm of sleep, my own tears tracing silent paths into my pillow. We had crossed a line, and I had no idea what world we would wake up to. The world I woke up to was one of profound and deafening silence. The space next to me in the bed was cold. Leo was gone. I sat up, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. A quick scan of the room showed no sign of him. His clothes were gone. His shoes were gone from their usual spot by the door. I walked into the living room, a sense of dread coiling in my stomach. The couch was empty, the down comforter folded neatly and placed on the cushions. On the kitchen counter, where a scribbled note sometimes lay, there was nothing. He had vanished, erased himself from my apartment as if he had never been there. as if the night before had been a fever dream. The only evidence that it had been real was the faint, lingering scent of his shampoo on my pillow and the hollow ache in the center of my being. My phone buzzed later that morning. A text from him. My hands trembled as I opened it, a desperate, foolish hope fluttering in my chest. The message was 3 words. Sorry about last night. That was it. No explanation. No emotion. Just a sterile, cowardly apology that felt more like a slap in the face than the kiss had. I stared at the words until they blurred, the screen a cruel, glowing rectangle of rejection. I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? How could I articulate the maelstrom of confusion and hurt and betrayal that was raging inside me? He had taken my most secret, fragile hope, held it in his hands for one brief, shining moment. And then, in the cold light of day, he had crushed it. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. He didn't call, he didn't text again, he didn't show up at my door. My apartment, which had so recently felt like a shared space, a haven, now felt like a tomb. Every corner of it echoed with his absence. The empty space on the couch mocked me. The toothbrush still in the mug by the sink felt like a cruel joke. The permanent phone charger by the couch seemed to accuse me of a foolish naivety. I was haunted by the ghost of his presence. I tried to work, to lose myself in my photography, but my focus was shattered. I would stare at images on my screen for hours, unable to make a single creative decision. Every shadow, every composition, seemed to speak of loneliness. The world outside my window seemed to have lost its color, everything muted and gray. I replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times, dissecting every moment, every touch, every whispered word, searching for the clue I had missed. Had I misinterpreted everything? Was I just a port in a storm, a moment of desperate, confused comfort for a man who was adrift? Had he woken up in the morning, horrified by what he had done, repulsed by me, by himself? The thought was a sharp, physical pain. The tenderness, the vulnerability, the tears, had it all been a lie? A performance? No, I couldn't believe that. The grief I had held in my arms had been real. The trembling in his hands had been real. His fear was real. But his fear had won. He had run from whatever he felt in that darkness, run from me. And in doing so, he had left a trail of emotional wreckage in his wake. My hurt slowly began to curdle into a cold, quiet anger. I wasn't angry that he was confused or scared. I was angry that he had made his confusion my burden to bear. I was angry that he had opened a door in me and then slammed it shut without a word. I was angry at his cowardice. He didn't have the right to do that, to take such a profound piece of my vulnerability and then treat it, and me, as something to be discarded and apologized for. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't let it lie. The ambiguity was poison. I needed to know the truth, even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine. I needed to look him in the eye and hear it from his own mouth. The not knowing was destroying me, hollowing me out from the inside. So, on a cold, starless evening, I put on my coat and walked out of my apartment. I didn't take the subway. I walked the 2 miles to his apartment building, the cold air a sharp, clarifying slap against my face. With every step, my resolve hardened. I wasn't going there to yell or to demand an apology. I was going there to demand the respect of an honest conversation. He owed me that much. He owed our friendship that much. I stood outside his apartment door for a long time, my hand raised to knock, my courage wavering. I could hear the faint sound of a television inside. He was home. I took a deep breath and knocked, 3 sharp raps that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. The television sound was cut off. I heard footsteps, a hesitation, and then the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he peered out. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles underneath them. He hadn't shaved in days. He was wearing the same worn-out sweatshirt that was usually draped over the back of my armchair. When he saw it was me, a look of pure panic flashed across his face. He tried to close the door. "Leo, no," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I put my hand on the door, not forcing it, but holding it in place. "Don't. Please," he stared at my hand, then back at my face, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. He let out a long, defeated sigh and opened the door wider, stepping back to let me in. His apartment was exactly as he had described it, cold and impersonal. The furniture was sleek and modern, but looked like it had been chosen from a catalog, devoid of any personality. There were takeout containers on the coffee table and a sense of deep neglect in the air. It was not a home, it was a holding cell. He didn't meet my eyes. He just walked over to the window and stood with his back to me, staring out at the city lights. I stood in the middle of the room, my coat still on, feeling like an intruder. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, I broke it. "What was that, Leo?" I asked, my voice quiet but unyielding. "What happened?" He flinched, but he didn't turn around. "I told you." "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice directed at the window pane. "No," I said, taking a step closer. "That's not good enough. Sorry is what you say when you bump into someone on the street. You don't get to do what you did, to come into my home, into my bed, and then just disappear and send a 3-word text message. I deserve more than that. Our friendship deserves more than that." He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. "What do you want me to say, Julian?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to say. I don't know what I'm doing." "Then tell me that." I shot back, my voice rising with a week's worth of frustration and pain. "Talk to me. Don't just run away and leave me to pick up the pieces of whatever that was. Do you have any idea what this past week has been like for me? Do you have any idea how much you hurt me?" His face crumpled. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come, replaced by the familiar, aching need to comfort him. But I held my ground. This wasn't about me fixing him this time. This was about him facing the truth. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "You're the last person in the world I would ever want to hurt. Then why did you run?" I asked, my voice softening. "Why did you kiss me if you were just going to run away?" That was the question that finally broke him. He sank down onto his stylish, uncomfortable sofa, as if his legs could no longer support him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Because I was terrified," he choked out from behind his hands. "I am terrified." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "That night, being with you, it was the first time in years I felt real. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't playing a part. Everything with Chloe, my job, this whole life. It feels like a costume I've been wearing for so long I forgot I even had it on. But when I'm with you, in your apartment, the costume comes off. I can just be." And that night, lying next to you in the dark, it felt like the most honest place I had ever been. He took a ragged breath. "So I kissed you. Because it felt like the only honest thing to do. It felt right. It felt more right than anything I've ever done with anyone. And that's what scared you?" I asked gently, closing the distance between us and sitting down in a chair opposite him. He nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "It scared the hell out of me. Because what does that mean, Julian? I've only ever been with women. I've built my entire life, my entire identity, on that fact. And then you. It doesn't fit into any of the boxes. It doesn't make any sense." I woke up the next morning, and the sun was coming up, and I looked at you, and all I could feel was this overwhelming panic. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I ran. I ran because I don't know who I am if I'm the person who feels that way about his best friend. I don't know what to do with that. His confession hung in the air, raw and honest and heartbreaking. All my anger was gone, replaced by a profound wave of empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who had come face to face with a truth so large it threatened to shatter his entire understanding of himself. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. We talked for hours after that. The city lights outside the window are only witnesses. For the first time, the conversation was not about his work or my photography or any of the surface-level topics we usually discussed. We talked about fear and loneliness and the quiet desperation of feeling lost in your own life. He told me about the crushing weight of expectation he'd felt since he was a kid, the pressure to be the confident, successful, straight man everyone thought he was. He admitted that his relationship with Chloe had been more about fulfilling a role than about genuine connection. He confessed that for the past year, the only moments of true peace he had experienced were the nights he spent asleep on my couch. He wasn't using me for comfort. He was drawn to me because I was the only person with whom he could be his unedited, unarmored self. And I, in turn, finally told him the truth. I told him that my feelings for him had shifted years ago, that I had been in love with him for longer than I cared to admit. I told him about the wall I had built, the years I had spent hiding that part of myself from him to protect our friendship. I told him that his presence in my apartment had been both a gift and a form of exquisite torture. As I spoke, the weight of a decade of secrets lifted from my shoulders. The fear I had carried for so long, the fear of his rejection, simply evaporated into the honest air of that room. He listened to every word, his eyes never leaving my face, a look of dawning comprehension, of regret, and of something else, something that looked like wonder, on his face. When I finished, the room was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not empty or tense. It was full, a space cleared of all the obstacles and misunderstandings we had allowed to grow between us. "I'm so sorry, Julian," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for being so blind. For so long, you had nothing to see," I said. "I never showed you, maybe," he said, a small, sad smile on his face. "Or maybe I just didn't want to look. Because it would have meant looking at myself, too." He reached across the space between us and took my hand. His grip was firm, sure. "I don't know what this is," he said, his eyes searching mine. "And I don't know where it goes. I'm still scared. But I know one thing. I don't want to run anymore. And I don't want to lose you. Can we just figure it out? Together?" A profound, quiet peace settled over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. The storm had passed. The ground, though shaken, was stable beneath my feet. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady and clear. Together, we didn't magically solve everything that night. There was no grand, cinematic kiss to seal our new understanding. The path forward was still uncertain, shrouded in the fog of his own self-discovery. But something fundamental had been repaired. The foundation, which had been cracked and strained, was now being reset, this time in the solid bedrock of honesty. He asked me to stay the night, not in a plea for comfort, but as a simple, direct request for my company. I slept in his bed, and he slept on the couch, a reversal of our usual ritual. It was a gesture of respect, of giving me back the space I had so freely given him. In the morning, we made coffee together in his sterile kitchen, and for the first time, the space felt a little warmer, a little more like a home. The days that followed were a new beginning, a period of quiet, intentional recalibration. He didn't move into my apartment, and I didn't move into his. We started dating, in a way. We went for long walks. We cooked dinner together. We talked. We talked more than we ever had in 10 years of friendship. We were learning a new language with each other, a language of vulnerability and open-ended questions. He was on a journey of his own, and I knew my role was not to lead him, but to walk beside him, to be the steady presence he had always known me to be. There was a new tenderness between us, an ease to our physical proximity. A hand on the small of my back as we walked, a shared look across a crowded room, his head resting on my shoulder as we watched a movie. They were small, quiet gestures, but they were deliberate, unburdened by the ambiguity that had once plagued us. About a month after our conversation, he showed up at my door one evening with 2 large duffel bags. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a question in his eyes. I stepped aside and let him in. He dropped the bags on the floor and walked over to me. He framed my face with his hands and kissed me. This kiss was different from the first one. It was not born of confusion or desperation. It was sure and it was calm. It was a statement. When he pulled away, he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "My lease is up next month," he said. I was thinking I'd rather not renew. It was a simple sentence, but it held the weight of a new world. It was a choice, freely and consciously made. He wasn't running to me anymore. He was coming home. And so, we began to build our new life, not in the wreckage of the old one, but on the cleared ground of our shared truth. His things slowly began to merge with mine, his sleek, modern coffee maker looking comically out of place next to my collection of chipped, mismatched mugs. His presence was no longer a temporary state, but a permanent feature of my landscape. The couch was still his favorite spot, but now, when he fell asleep there, it wasn't an act of escape. It was just a man, comfortable and at peace in his own home. And most nights, he didn't fall asleep on the couch at all. He would come to bed with me, and we would lie in the darkness, talking softly or just existing in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. The bedroom door, once a symbol of my unspoken hope and his hesitant boundary, was now simply a door. And most nights, we closed it, not to shut the world out, but to create a space that was entirely, unequivocally, ours. There are moments in your life that are not loud, but they are profound. They are the quiet shifts, the slow developments that remake your world from the inside out. Our story wasn't one of sudden, dramatic passion. It was a slow burn, a gradual unearthing of a love that had been there all along, buried under years of friendship and fear. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, the most important journeys are not the ones that take us to new places, but the ones that finally allow us to be fully, honestly ourselves. We learned to navigate the new architecture of our relationship, building room by room, creating a structure that was strong enough to hold both our past and our future. We began to heal, not in grand declarations, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.